Do you believe in karma? I mean, truly, deeply believe that the universe has a way of settling its accounts. That the arrogant, the greedy, the people who move through life convinced they are always the smartest person in the room, eventually encounter the one situation they did not see coming, the one opponent they completely underestimated. I believe in it. Not in any mystical sense, not with incense and candles, but in the very practical, very human sense that the qualities that make certain people feel invincible are often the exact same qualities that make them catastrophically blind. Today, I want to tell you the story of Richard Calloway, 53 years old, senior executive at a private equity firm in Manhattan. A man who had spent 3 decades being right about almost everything, about markets, about deals, about people, and who had come to confuse that track record with a kind of permanent, unconditional superiority. A man who believed in the marrow of his bones that he was exceptional, that the rules that governed ordinary people were suggestions for someone like him, that he could look at any situation and read it correctly because he always had. He was wrong exactly once, and it cost him everything. But before we get to the ending, and I promise you, the ending is worth every single moment of patience, we have to understand who Richard was and who Eleanor was, and what 30 years of marriage looks like when one person inside it has been quietly paying attention in ways the other person never noticed. Richard had grown up in Connecticut, the son of a successful attorney, raised with the specific confidence of a man who has never been genuinely humbled. He was intelligent, genuinely intelligent, this is important to say, because it mattered to how everything unfolded. He was not a fool. He was not careless in the ordinary sense. He was, in his professional life, meticulous and sharp and difficult to outmaneuver. He had built real things. He had made real money. The firm where he worked bore, in part, his name. But intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, and Richard had spent 53 years accumulating one without any meaningful acquisition of the other. Eleanor had been his wife since 1993. They had met in their mid-20s when Richard was just beginning his career, and Eleanor was working as a financial analyst at a small investment firm in the city. She was quiet in the way that very observant people are often quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was almost always listening more carefully than the people around her realized. She had a mind for numbers that was, in its own way, as sharp as Richard's, though Richard had long since stopped noticing this, in the manner of men who marry capable women and then gradually stop seeing the capability. Over 30 years, Eleanor had done what many women of her generation and circumstance did. She had oriented her professional ambitions around the marriage, around the household, around the children who came and grew up and eventually left. She had not disappeared into that role. She had remained, to anyone paying attention, a woman of considerable intelligence and organizational precision. But Richard had stopped paying attention to Eleanor somewhere around the 15th year of their marriage, which is to say, he had stopped seeing her as someone who might surprise him, and had settled into the comfortable assumption that she was simply there, in the way that furniture is there, present, functional, unremarkable. This was his first mistake. It was also, ultimately, his last. By 2021, Richard was bored. This is the word he would have used if he were honest with himself, which he rarely was. Bored with the marriage. Bored with the predictability of evenings in the apartment on the Upper East Side, with the dinners that followed the same rhythms they had followed for a decade, with a woman he had decided he already knew completely. He was also, though he would not have named it this way, afraid. Afraid of being 53. Afraid of the particular invisibility that arrives for men of a certain age when the professional validation begins to feel insufficient, when the reflection in the mirror requires more active negotiation than it once did. He began browsing online, not immediately with any specific intention, the way people browse when they are restless and discontented and looking for something they cannot precisely name. He found, through channels he had taken some care to keep private, a platform that catered to what its marketing described as sophisticated connections for discerning individuals, which is to say, an expensive, exclusive online dating site used primarily by wealthy men looking for significantly younger women. He created a profile under a variation of his name, using a photograph taken several years earlier, at an angle that flattered him. He paid the premium subscription fee without hesitation. The amount was trivial by his standards, and the privacy features it purchased felt, to him, comprehensive. He was wrong about that too, of course, but we'll get there. The profile had been active for 3 weeks when Isabella appeared. She reached out first, which Richard noted with satisfaction. Her profile photograph showed a woman in her mid-20s, dark-haired, strikingly beautiful in the specific way that stopped the eye and held it. Her profile described her as a model, originally from Milan, currently splitting time between Miami and New York. Her messages were warm, but not desperate, interested but selective in the way that made Richard feel, from the first exchange, that he had been chosen rather than simply found. Have you ever watched someone walk into a trap that was built specifically for them, designed around their precise shape, their specific weight, their particular way of moving? That is what was happening to Richard Calloway from the very first message, but he couldn't see it. He was inside it, and the trap was indistinguishable from a dream. Their correspondence began in October of 2021. It was, in its early stages, conducted with a restraint that Richard found maddening in the most pleasurable way. Isabella did not rush. She was interested in him, in his work, in his thoughts about the market, in his opinions about places she claimed to have traveled. She was curious and engaged, and she asked good questions, which Richard found more flattering than any compliment, because a good question implies that the answer is worth having. Over the first several weeks, the conversations became longer and more frequent. Isabella began appearing in his thoughts during the workday, which Richard recognized as a sign that something significant was happening, and which he welcomed in the way of a man who has been numb for long enough that any sensation feels like proof of life. By December, they were exchanging messages every day. By January, they had progressed to a level of personal disclosure that Richard had not experienced in years, perhaps decades, certainly not within the marriage, which had long since settled into the particular silence of two people who have stopped telling each other things. He told Isabella things about himself that he had never articulated to another person: his fears about aging, his feeling that he had built something impressive but not something meaningful, his longing for, and here his messages became almost embarrassingly earnest, passion. The specific electric feeling of being wanted by someone who truly saw him. Isabella provided all of this with remarkable consistency. Her messages arrived at the right moments. They were warm when warmth was needed and teasing when levity served. She referenced things he had said weeks earlier. She appeared in every measurable way to be exactly what she claimed to be: a young, beautiful woman who had, against all reasonable probability, developed genuine feelings for a 53-year-old private equity executive in Manhattan. The video calls, though, there was always a reason: a bad connection, a sudden scheduling conflict, a situation with a photographer she was working with that made the timing impossible. Richard pressed, gently at first, and then with increasing insistence. And Isabella was always apologetic and always had an explanation that was specific and plausible, and followed by a renewed warmth that made the frustration dissolve. He told himself stories about this. Men who want to believe something badly enough are astonishing architects of justification. Perhaps she was shy on camera. Perhaps she was protecting herself in the reasonable way of a young woman navigating attention from older men online. Perhaps the connection issues were genuine. Technology was unreliable. He knew this. He had, by this point, enough invested emotionally that the alternative explanation, that something was not what it seemed, was a thought he approached and moved quickly away from, the way you move away from a door you do not wish to open. By the spring of 2022, the relationship had reached the stage that Isabella described, in language Richard found both moving and intoxicating, as a crossroads. She had been offered an opportunity, a chance to establish herself somewhere permanently, to stop the exhausting transience of the modeling life, to build something real. But real things required real foundations. And she had. She said this with what read as a vulnerability she was not accustomed to, come to feel that Richard was the person she wanted to build that with. She had found a property in Miami. A house, not a large one, she said, but beautiful, the kind of place where she could finally stop moving. The price was $1.2 million. Richard wired the money within a week. He told himself it was an investment. He told himself it was what you did when you were serious about something. He told himself that a man of his resources making this kind of gesture was not recklessness, but commitment, and that the distinction mattered. He moved the funds from a joint business account he shared with Eleanor, one of several such accounts connected to ventures they had built together over the years, into an intermediary account, and from there to the offshore account Isabella had provided in careful, specific detail. Eleanor's name was on those business accounts. Eleanor reviewed those accounts, as she had always reviewed them, as part of the financial management that had been part of her contribution to their shared life for 30 years. Eleanor noticed the transfer. She did not say anything. This is the moment I need you to really sit with, because this is where the story you think you are hearing reveals itself to be a completely different story. Eleanor noticed $1.2 million leave a joint account in the spring of 2022. She said nothing to Richard. She did not confront him. She did not call an attorney. She did not change her behavior in any way that Richard would have noticed, which is to say, she remained, to his complete perception, exactly the unremarkable, familiar, invisible woman she had been for years. What she did instead was open a laptop. Eleanor had suspected something was wrong several months before the money moved. Not a specific suspicion, not with evidence, just the particular alertness of someone who has been paying close attention to another person for 30 years and has noticed a shift in the quality of his distraction. The specific light in his eyes when he looked at his phone, the way he angled the screen, the new password on the personal laptop he had always left open on the desk in the study. She did not need to access the laptop. She already had access to the email account he had created for Isabella's correspondence, because Eleanor had created that email account. She had found the dating site profile within a week of Richard creating it, through methods that were not dramatic, but were methodical. She had always had the passwords to the household accounts. She was familiar with his patterns, and she was, as she had always been, more attentive than he gave her credit for. She had read his first message to Isabella before Isabella had existed. And then she had become Isabella. Have you ever heard of something so audacious, so perfectly constructed, so specifically calibrated to the exact shape of another person's ego, that your first response is not shock, but a kind of awe? That is the only appropriate response to what Eleanor did next. She became, with a consistency and a craft that required 18 months of sustained daily performance, the exact woman that Richard's loneliness and vanity had been waiting for. Every message, every delayed video call, every careful escalation of intimacy, every reference to previous conversations, every moment of apparent vulnerability, every declaration that had made Richard feel, for the first time in years, fully and passionately alive. All of it was Eleanor. Sitting, most likely, in the apartment on the Upper East Side while Richard was at work, or at the kitchen table after he had gone to sleep, composing messages with the same financial precision she had always brought to the accounts he had long since stopped noticing she managed. The $1.2 million Miami property was purchased in Eleanor's name through a legal structure she had built with an attorney she had retained separately, paying the retainer from a personal account Richard did not know she had maintained since the early years of the marriage. The cars, 2 luxury vehicles Richard had wired money for over the following months, gifts to the woman he was planning to leave his wife for, were similarly structured. Every transfer Richard made to Isabella's offshore account was legally routed, through layers that Eleanor had constructed carefully and with professional guidance, into accounts that belonged to her. By the time Richard packed his bags in September of 2023, Eleanor had received, through the Isabella persona, just over $2 million. She had spent approximately 18 months becoming a woman her husband was desperately in love with, and she had done it while living in the same apartment, sleeping in the same bed, sitting across from him at the same dining table where she was now waiting for him. Richard came downstairs with his bags. He had rehearsed this moment. He had thought about what he would say and how he would say it, and had prepared himself for tears, for pleading, for the scene he assumed would accompany the end of a 30-year marriage. He had the divorce papers in his hand. Eleanor was at the dining table. There was a glass of wine in front of her. She looked to Richard's eye, calm in a way that he attributed to ignorance. She didn't know yet, he thought, and the telling would be the hard part. She slid a folder across the table before he could speak. Imagine the specific quality of that silence. The folder landing in front of him, the thickness of it. Richard setting down his bags because something in Eleanor's expression had communicated, without any words at all, that he should set down the bags. He opened the folder. Every message, every declaration, every wire transfer, each one documented with date and amount and destination account. Every gift, cross-referenced with the offshore account records. The property deed to the Miami house. The vehicle registration documents. All of it organized with the financial precision of someone who had spent her career managing accounts and had brought every skill she possessed to the construction of this particular document. Richard looked at the papers. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the papers again. Eleanor explained it to him in the calm, informational tone of someone walking a client through a financial statement. She told him when she had first suspected something. She told him how she had found the profile. She told him when she had become Isabella. And she described, with a specificity that I imagine was excruciating, certain moments from their correspondence that had been particularly instructive regarding what he thought of her, of their marriage, of the woman he had spent 2 years worshiping from across a kitchen table without recognizing her voice. She told him that every dollar he had sent to Isabella had been legally received as a voluntary gift and was now held in accounts to which he had no legal access and no legal claim, because Richard had given the money freely and enthusiastically to a persona, and the persona's legal infrastructure had been built by Eleanor and her attorney to be exactly what it appeared to be, a separate individual receiving gifts from a willing donor. She told him she had spoken with their divorce attorney. Then she slid the second folder across the table. Have you ever tried to imagine what it feels like to have the architecture of your own arrogance described back to you in complete detail, in the voice of the person you most underestimated, in the room where you have been living your secret life while she sat 4 walls away and knew every word of it? I have tried to imagine it. I cannot get all the way there. I think the closest approximation is the specific horror of a person who has just understood, all at once, the total scope of their own blindness. Richard had moved $2 million out of their joint accounts. Those accounts were also Eleanor's, and the transfers had been made without her consent, which meant that the legal picture was not one that Richard's attorneys found encouraging. The $2 million, now in Eleanor's accounts, was legally hers. What remained in the joint accounts and in Richard's personal holdings was subject to the divorce proceedings, in which Eleanor was entitled to half. Her attorney had been working on the asset documentation for over a year. Richard's attorney, whom he called from the dining room table while Eleanor sat with her wine, told him within 20 minutes of reviewing the preliminary information that the situation was exactly as bad as it appeared, and possibly worse, because the Isabella transactions, when examined, would not read as theft or misappropriation from Richard's perspective. They would read as voluntary transfers, which is what they were, which is precisely why Eleanor had done it this way. Richard had given away $2 million to the woman he loved. That woman was his wife. His wife had received and legally secured the money. His wife was now divorcing him and taking half of what remained. The man who had spent 53 years being the smartest person in the room sat at his dining table and understood, in a way that no previous experience had prepared him for, what it felt like to have been completely and perfectly outplayed. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 2024. Eleanor received her half of the remaining marital assets, which combined with the $2 million she had already secured, left her, by any reasonable accounting, in a significantly better financial position than Richard. She purchased a property, Not in Miami, she had always preferred the Northeast, and relocated with a quietness that matched every other aspect of how she had handled the preceding 2 years. Richard retained enough to not be technically destitute, but the combination of the Isabella transfers and the divorce settlement left him in a position that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had wired that first payment in the spring of 2022. The firm restructured his role. The apartment on the Upper East Side was sold as part of the settlement. The particular social world of a successful Manhattan executive is one that contracts very quickly when the success becomes ambiguous and the marriage ends under circumstances that eventually people hear about. He was, in the most important senses, alone. Without the marriage he had taken for granted, without the money he had moved with such confident impunity, without the woman he had spent 2 years worshiping because that woman had never existed, and the woman who had performed her so flawlessly was no longer in his life in any form. I want to say something about Eleanor before I leave you with this story. What Eleanor did was not simple. It was not, despite the satisfaction it provides as a narrative, an easy thing to execute or to sustain. 18 months of daily performance, of writing love letters to your husband from behind a false identity, of watching him fall in love with a version of you he could not see. That is not a painless undertaking. There is grief in it. There is the specific, terrible grief of confirmation, of watching the person you have been married to for 30 years reveal, message by message, exactly what he thinks of you, exactly what he has been missing, exactly what he believes himself to deserve. Eleanor did not do this from a position of strength and indifference. She did it from a position of injury, of 30 years of accumulated invisibility, of the cold, clear-eyed calculation that she had one opportunity to protect herself, and she was going to take it with both hands. She had been invisible for years. She had been underestimated for years. She had managed their finances with competence that Richard had stopped noticing so long ago that he had begun to believe the accounts managed themselves. She had maintained through all of it the discipline to wait, not for revenge in any emotional sense, but for the moment when the situation had developed enough that she could act with complete legal protection and complete documentation, when the trap had been built all the way to its edges and she only needed to close it. Richard thought he had been playing a game with a 25-year-old model in Miami. He had been playing a game with Eleanor. He had simply never known the game was happening, which is precisely why he lost it so completely. There are people in our lives who are watching, who are listening, who are remembering, who understand us with a precision and a depth that we are not aware of because we stopped paying attention to them long before they stopped paying attention to us. The most dangerous opponent you will ever face is not a stranger. It is someone you have underestimated for 30 years, who knows everything about you and has had a very long time to think about what to do with that knowledge. Richard Calloway thought he was living a secret. He was starring in someone else's plan. And Eleanor picked up her keys, walked out the front door of an apartment she no longer needed, and didn't look back. That, I think, is the definition of winning.